Saint Vincent Ferrer, Part 4. Chapter 10. The Saint's Last Apostolic Journeys in Brittany, to the Council of Constance, in Normandy, and again in Brittany. The first city in Brittany which St. Vincent evangelized was Nantes. He reached there 12 days following, morning and night, and wrought so many conversions and miracles that the inhabitants declared that they had never before witnessed anything like it. This city was steeped in every species of crime, but at the close of the mission was completely changed. Religion was deeply planted therein and practiced, and the morals of its people became holy and pure. From Nantes, the saint proceeded to Vannes, where the Duke and Duchess of Brittany resided. They gave him a reception which equaled, if it did not surpass, that which was accorded him at Toulouse. Many wealthy lords invited him to lodge in their palaces, but he refused those sumptuous abodes, and chose as his residence a humble cottage belonging to a person named Robin Scarbe. His entry into Vannes took place on the 20th of March, the Saturday before the fourth Sunday in Lent. The text of the opening discourse, which he preached on the following morning, was taken from the Gospel of the day. "Gather up the fragments that remain." John 6. These words, as would appear, bore a prophetic meaning. They invited the Bretons to profit by the last days of his preaching on earth, and the last fragment of God's words, which he had so long distributed to the multitude. The inhabitants of Vannes fully understood the saint's appeal. All sinners were converted. While the mission lasted, the law courts were vacated and the shops closed. The only occupation of all was to make their confessions, to do penance, to repair the injustice done to their neighbors, and to be reconciled to their enemies. So desirous were they to hear the saint that neither the inclemency of the weather, nor the piercing cold, nor the rain, nor the snow which fell for that period, could deter the thousands of his auditors from pressing around the pulpit. We must not forget that St. Vincent always preached in the open air. Among the graces which the saint's prayers brought to the ducal family of Brittany may be singled out in the blessing of fecundity, for we may justly attribute to the merit of his prayers to the birth of Duke Peter, who in after times took an active part in the work and expenses of the saint's canonization. The Count de Rohan, having heard the renown of the new apostle, achieved a lively desire to have him in his dominions. To satisfy his piety, St. Vincent went to Josselin, a small town in the diocese of St. Malo. He preached there with the usual happy results for the space of 8 days. He then proceeded to Rennes, and thence to Dinan and Lamballe. In the latter town our saint received pressing letters from the illustrious Chancellor Gerson, one of the lights of the councils of Constance. That great man once more invited Vincent to repair to the august assembly of the Universal Church, to aid it by his counsel, and to edify it by his example. The learned Peter d'Ailly, Cardinal and Archbishop of Cambrai, having added a postscript to Gerson's letter, Vincent judged it fitting to yield to their request. He had, moreover, a particular interest in explaining and justifying his conduct before the church. Whether through ignorance or from malice, there were many who confounded the sect of flagellants, who arose at the epoch with the discipulance of St. Vincent Ferrer. Gerson gave him prudent and charitable advice regarding this. It behooved him, he said, to contradict these false and injurious reports. St. Vincent then hastened on his way to Germany, and reached Constance some days before the last session of the council. His presence smoothed down the difficulties that yet remained. On the 11th of November, 1417, measures were able to be taken to proceed to the election of a sovereign pontiff, which ended in the nomination of Martin V. After this great achievement, St. Vincent delivered a discourse in Latin to thank God for the re-establishment of union and peace in the Church. Toward the close of the same year, or at the commencement of the following, the holy apostle, thinking that the last election of the sovereign pontiff rendered his sojourn at Constance no longer necessary, and desiring to continue his preaching among the people whom he had begun to evangelize, left Germany and hastened his return into Brittany. He spent the whole of the month of April, 1418, in traversing the province of Anjou, and gathering on every side most abundant fruits. Wishing afterwards to fulfill a promise he had made to the King of England, he proceeded into Normandy. He preached at St. Lo, at Caen, where the king was staying, and in many other towns in the province, instructing the people throughout and reforming their morals. In the meantime, the Duchess of Brittany informed the saint that she was about to give birth to another child, and requested him to come to baptize it immediately after its birth. St. Vincent obeyed the summons, preaching on his journey in his diocese of Rennes, St. Malo, St. Brieuc, Quimper, and Nantes. Arriving in the latter city towards the end of the month of November, he preached the Advent, and thence directed his steps to Vannes, at the close of the year 1419. He rested on the way to the Cistercian Abbey of Notre-Dame des Prairies. He was seized with a grievous malady, and the first symptom of his approaching end. As soon as he could support the fatigues of traveling, however, without being completely restored, he resumed his journey to Vannes, where he arrived at the end of February. He was received with indescribable enthusiasm. The Duchess would gladly have lodged him in her own palace, but the saint once more repaired to the cottage of Robin Scarbe. Unmindful of his sufferings and fatigue, he commenced immediately to preach, but his bodily weakness soon betrayed itself, and he was compelled to succumb. He then exercised the sacred ministry in another way. He instructed the children in Christian doctrine, which, in the latter days of his life, was his most cherished occupation. This brilliant star of the Church set at Vannes. Before, however, recounting the circumstance of his death, the glory with which God accompanied it, and the devotion which had been paid to him, even to our own times, we may be permitted to give a feeble outline of some of the virtues of this great saint, and of the extraordinary gifts with which God favored him. Section the fourth. The Virtues of St. Vincent Ferrer. Chapter 11. The virtues of St. Vincent Ferrer in their relation to their service of God the saint's charity towards his neighbor, his heroic devotedness to the temporal necessities of his brethren. The heart of our saint was forever attached to God by the sweet bonds of faith, hope, and love. We shall comprehend the liveliness of his faith by the vast numbers of miracles which he wrought from the commencement of his life to the day of his death. It is to marvel that the gospel attributes the accomplishment of marvels. If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, said the Lord, and you say to this mountain, remove from thence thither, and it shall remove. The faith of St. Vincent was doubtless very great, since every day of his life, so to speak, was marked by the miracles which flowed therefrom. We have already stated with what care he learned from his childhood the truths of religion. He inculcated them to others with equal solicitude. One of the occupations of his ministry, to which he attached special importance, was to teach the ignorant and children the words and meanings of the Apostles' Creed. He recommended all to recite, morning and evening, this profession of faith as a defensive weapon against error. He, moreover, earnestly exhorted Christians to conform their practice to their belief. The diamond, said he, is easily lost in the dunghill, and the precious pearl of faith is in great danger of being lost in a conscience defiled with the filth of sin. The saint's hope was even more lively. He made daily use of the means of salvation instituted by the divine providence. He made his confession every day, and received the sacrament of the Eucharist. He faithfully accomplished the duties of his calling, and resisted not the inspirations of grace. Few saints have been favored in the same degree. We allude especially to the assurance, which was on many occasions divinely revealed to him, and on the subject of his eternal salvation, and of his predestination to great glory. The spiritual instruction for the 8th day of the novena in the honor of the saint contains touching proof of his confidence in God. But this sentiment was not confined to himself alone. He felt it even in regards to others, as we read in the 5th instruction after the saint's feast. We will cite here another example. A sick person at the hour of death fell into despair at the sight of the crimes which he felt his conscience burdened. He refused to purify his soul by sacramental confession. Replying to the priests who exhorted him to this act, and his iniquities were too great, the language of the unhappy Cain. The saint, who was then in the neighborhood, being apprised of the dying man's condition, and of the evil dispositions which animated him, hastened to him and spoke tenderly to him. But the latter answered him as he had done the others, with words of despair. St. Vincent replied, "You well know, however, my dear brother, that the good Jesus died for you on the cross. Why then despair of his mercy?" These words, instead of softening the miserable man, only incited his fury, and in a paroxysm of impiety he exclaimed, "It is precisely on that account that I wish to be damned, to displease Jesus Christ." The depth of his despair excited further hope of St. Vincent, who, full of confidence at the mercy and omnipotence of God, turned his face towards the dying man, and said, "I will save thee in spite of thyself." He immediately invited those present to invoke with fervor the Holy Virgin, Mother of all goodness, and to recite the Rosary. God was pleased to show, by a miraculous manifestation, how pleasing to him was the heroic hope of his servant. Before the rosary was at an end, the sick man's chamber was flooded with an immense light, and the Mother of God appeared. She bore in her arms the divine child, who was covered with bleeding wounds. The despairing sinner, witness of this spectacle, was totally changed. Full of compunction, he asked pardon of God and man for the blasphemies which he had uttered. And having received the sacraments of the Church, shortly afterwards expired, with his soul prepared to ascend to heaven. Another sign of his unbounded hope in God's providence was the little solicitude which he evinced in the course of his great apostolate, either for his own personal maintenance or that of the numerous company which followed him. His confidence in his heavenly Father never failed him. Neither he nor his companions were ever in want, and on one occasion our Lord came miraculously to their aid, as may be seen in the instruction for the second Friday after the festival of the saint. Who shall say how ardent was the love which consumed the heart of St. Vincent Ferrer for his God, his Creator, his Redeemer? He thought always of him. He preserved a constant remembrance of his benefits, glorified him forever in the depths of his soul. His conversation, like that of his blessed father, St. Dominic, was all in God. This love of his frequently drew sighs from his heart and tears from his eyes. What he did not do to procure God's glory and the extension of his kingdom in souls, it was to consecrate himself entirely to this, that he renounced the delights of solitude, traveled Europe through and through, crossed mountains and plains, suffered hunger and thirst, heat and cold, endured untold fatigue. How generously he despised the riches and honors of the world. He was sensitive only to what was offensive to God. Seeing the iniquities which covered the world in his day, he fell so grievously ill at Avignon and Perpignan that he was in imminent danger of death. A heavenly hand restored him to health, which he entirely devoted to glorifying God and saving souls. This idea of God's glory completely absorbed him, and reasonably supposing that the esteem in which he was object among men, and the honor which was paid to him, referred to the divine praise, and not to himself, he yielded to them, not through feelings of vanity, but out of pure love to God. He willingly followed his hands to be kissed, and pieces of his habit to be divided among the people as relics. He knew by experience that such was indeed the will of God, and it was notified in a remarkable manner to the whole of his native city. Going on one occasion to Valencia, and before entering the city, he sent some of his disciples to prepare the customary reception with the most pompous solemnity. But the Duke of Cordova, who that year resided at Valencia in quality of viceroy, attributed this triumphant display to pride, declined to sanction it. And yet, scarcely had he expressed his refusal when all the bells in the city commenced to ring without any visible impulsion. The inhabitants understood the meaning of the prodigy, and of their own accord went forth to meet their illustrious townsman with all the pomp and magnificence which they could command. The bells continued to sound forth their merry chimes until the saint arrived at the convent of his order. Shall we speak also of the tender devotion of St. Vincent towards the Blessed Virgin and the saints? Preaching, as he was wont, at least twice a day, he did not allow a single day to pass without saying something about the saint whose feast it was. He dwelt on their glory and virtues, and inflamed all hearts with the desire to honor and imitate them. A young man of Barcelona, having heard him on the feast of St. Margaret extol the triumphs of that young martyr over the devil, burned with the desire to rush into combat with the enemy of salvation. Meeting in the way a poor old man was deaf, and who uttered some inarticulate words, took him for Satan, and falling furiously upon him, severely maltreated him. St. Vincent stayed the death of the poor man until he could receive the sacraments with becoming dispositions, while he also rebuked the imprudence of the youth. This act, nevertheless, shows us the ardor which animated him for the glory of the saints. If faith and zeal for God's glory and the desire to render his ministry efficacious induced St. Vincent Ferrer to work wonders, it behoves us to add that another motive also led him to beseech God to accomplish them. This was the tender compassion which he felt for the pains, sorrows, and sufferings of men. Hence those sudden deliverances from inevitable danger, those cures of every species of malady, whose resuscitation, even from death, which he effected while living. When 6 years old, he was taken to a child of his own age, who was afflicted with a dangerous pustule in the neck. He was told to touch the affected part. Vincent was not content with touching the wound. He kissed it. From that moment that his lips came in contact with the purulent flesh, the malady was instantly cured, and the wound closed. We read in the instruction of the first Friday before the saint's feast how readily he cured a poor man at Montelou, who importuned him. He also forestalled the wishes of the sufferers. Preaching one day at Lerida, in the presence of the King of Aragon, and an immense multitude assembled in one of the public squares, he stopped in the midst of his discourse, and exclaimed that he saw at the distance of half a league a poor paralytic, striving with the utmost difficulty to reach the city. He besought the king to dispatch some of his servants to his aid, and to bring him before him. 2 persons went off immediately, who found the afflicted man making ineffectual efforts to proceed. They took him in their arms, and brought him to the saint. As they were approaching the platform on which he stood, raising his hand, he made the sign of the cross over the paralytic. At that same instant, the sufferer was completely cured, and ran to the saint to thank him. To express still more of his gratitude, he attached himself to the saint for a long space of time. On another occasion, a woman came in deep desolation to see him. She had been unfaithful to her marriage vows during the prolonged absence of her husband, and was on the point of disclosing her shame by an adulterous childbirth. To complete her misery, she received a letter from her husband announcing his speedy arrival. She then went to seek aid and counsel of the man of God. St. Vincent first exhorted her to repentance, then encouraged her to have confidence in God, and promised that her husband's arrival should be delayed until there was no longer any danger. The event proved the truth of his words, and the efficacy of his prayers. The husband put off his return for an indefinite time. The woman was wholly astonished at the delay, and, in the interval, was relieved of her embarrassment, without compromising either her conscience or her reputation. When the husband at length arrived, the woman said to him, You told me in your letter that you would speedily return. Why then have you tarried so long?" The man replied, "I was returning not far from hence, when my mules, laden with goods, ran away. I was obliged to go after them, and have spent many days in consequence. At length I found them, and, thank God, none of the goods which they carried had been lost. The only injury that I have sustained is the loss of the few days which I went in pursuit of them." The woman fully comprehended the providential reason of the accident. She was filled with thankfulness to God and his servant, and repaired also to the injury she had done by leading thenceforth an irreproachable life. Thus did St. Vincent save a woman who was deserving of infamy and death, possibly even of eternal damnation. On another occasion she came to the aid of a woman who was unjustly accused by her husband. She gave birth to a child, and this man pretended, though he knew better, that the child was not his own. The intention was to separate himself from her, and he was desirous of having some apparent reason for doing so. Conscious only of her innocence, the unhappy mother, a prey to mortal anguish, went to confide her troubles to St. Vincent, who, she was informed, never refused consolation to the afflicted. The saint, indeed, gave her great comfort, and then said to her, "Come to my next sermon. Bid your husband mix with the audience, and omit not to bring your baby with you." The woman faithfully obeyed the instructions given her. When St. Vincent had opened his discourse, he, in the presence of a vast multitude, addressed himself to a little child only a few days old. "Leave thy mother's arms, and go in search of thy father in the midst of this great crowd of people." Wonderful to relate, the little child received in a miraculous manner the use of its feet, and threaded its way through the concourse of people unassisted, and, seizing the hand of its mother's husband, it cried out, "This is my father, I am really his child." The people were deeply affected at the sight of this prodigy. The unnatural father, thus publicly convicted of his fault, sobbed aloud, asked pardon of his wife for having calumniated her, and made full reparation for his fault by the assiduous practice of every domestic virtue. We will cite, moreover, the following example of our saint's ardent charity. The woman near the term of pregnancy, who was in dread of suffering, sent for him, and implored him to deliver her from the agonies which threatened her at the moment of childbirth. St. Vincent exhorted her to patience, and observed that the sufferings of that hour were the effect of God's will, and of a law which had been enforced since the beginning of the world. "Doubtless so," replied she, redoubling her importunities. "But he who made that law can, by a miracle, exempt me from it, and I hope he will do so by the merits of your blessing." Seeing her confidence, St. Vincent said to her, "Have courage, my good woman. I will take the burden on myself, and you shall not sustain any harm at that critical moment." He then blessed her and departed. The hour arrived, and St. Vincent felt within himself physical suffering equivalent to that of a woman in travail. As the person who had sought his help, she experienced neither pain nor accident of any kind. Such is the charity of the saints. They are not content with sharing the sufferings of their brethren, but joyfully take the whole on themselves. Thus the seraphic Virgin of Siena takes entirely on herself the pains of purgatory which her father ought to suffer. Thus does Saint Michael of the Order of the Trinity, with God's permission, undertake a malignant fever from which a friend of his is suffering. The great model of saints gave the first example of this. Surely he hath borne infirmities, saith the prophet, and carried our sorrows. St. Vincent left him lasting memorials of his admirable charity. The number of hospitals, asylums, refuges, churches, even bridges, which he founded during his apostolic journeyings, is almost incredible. Having at his disposal a considerable staff in the bands of people who accompanied him, he availed himself of their services to build hastily those edifices consecrated to charity. He left some of those in almost every country through which he passed. One of his most remarkable foundations was the orphanage at Valencia, his birthplace, and an establishment which had borne his name even to this day. St. Vincent de Paul gloried in St. Vincent Ferrer as his patron. We can well conceive that the examples of charity in the model would not be without their influence on the holy priest who essayed to walk in his footsteps. Chapter 12. Incomparable zeal of St. Vincent Ferrer for the salvation of souls. Other virtues of the saint. The principal object of the order of friars preacher is to labor for the salvation of souls. Thus did the saint comprehend it, and to this end he did apply himself with such ardor. His constant study was to find out every means possible to withdraw souls from sin, to reconcile them to God, and to conduct them in the paths of perfect sanctity. While at Avignon he was informed of an ecclesiastical dignitary whose life was not conformable to the holiness of his state. He spent the whole night in prayer to God for his conversion. At daybreak, being moved by a divine inspiration, he repaired to the prelate's palace with a crucifix in his hand, and entering he pushed his way into the chamber where he reposed. He immediately opened one of the windows, and returning to the prelate, who was in bed, addressed him thus: "My son," said he, "behold the divine Jesus, and consider how good and full of love he is. You fly from him, but he comes with confidence to the very foot of your bed to find you. Make then your peace, my son. Make your peace with Jesus. What does it avail you to have so often offended him? It is enough, it is enough. Embrace your sweet master and love him." Saying this, he placed the crucifix to the lips of the ecclesiastic and hastily left him. The prelate, stupefied and ashamed, entered into himself, and pressing the image of our Lord to his breast, he got up. Then falling prostrate on the floor, he wept bitterly over his past disorders, implored pardon of God, and made a firm resolution of amendment. Dressing himself in great haste, he hurried off to the saint, who was waiting for him, and who was assured, by the light from on high, of his conversion. He made his confession, and thenceforth practiced the holiness and regularity of life befitting his calling. The saint was on another occasion preaching at Pampeluna, when he was suddenly enraptured in the midst of his discourse. Returning to himself, he informed his audience that God commanded him to interrupt his preaching in order to put a stop to a grievous offense that is being committed in the city. He immediately descended from the pulpit, and, followed by a group of persons surprised and curious to see what would happen, bent his steps towards a sumptuous palace. The doors were closed. He touched one of them with his hand, and it immediately opened of itself. When he entered, he declaimed with great energy against the impure vice while traversing the halls and chambers. They who followed him saw no one, but they distinctly heard voices of the wretched people who were the victims of their sinful passion. St. Vincent implored them to desist, but they persisted in their sin. He threatened them with terrible chastisements, but they derided him all the more. Then God avenged himself on their crime. They were changed into statues of marble. The saint entered the chamber and disclosed to the bystanders the terrible way in which the divine vengeance had chastised the crimes and obstinacy of those unhappy people. Nevertheless, being touched with compassion, he approached the statues, and breathing into their mouths, restored them to life. This act of charity also changed their hearts of stone into hearts of flesh. They acknowledged their guilt, and made their confession one after the other. Hardly had they received sacramental absolution, than the vehemence of their contrition brought death a second time, for they expired at the feet of the saint. God blessed the zeal of his servant by his wonderful conversion to show how agreeable to him was his charity, which never shrank from any means calculated to save the souls of his neighbors. So great was St. Vincent's love for souls that he unhesitatingly accepted the most heroic sacrifices to ensure their salvation. When preaching in Spain, he was one day called to a dying person older in sin than in years. The latter was unwilling to be spoken to on the subject of confession, and was resolved to crown the wickedness of his life with final despair. Vincent arrived, but all his advances were met by a steady refusal on the part of the sick man. Then the saint said to him, "I assure you that God has pardoned you. I have prayed for you. I have obtained mercy. Nay, more, whatever merits I may have, these I have entirely made over to you." At these words, which marked such singular generosity, the troubled soul of the dying man was somewhat reassured, and he replied, "I will make my confession, but you must beforehand put it in writing, both the petition for pardon and the promised donation." "With all my heart," said the saint, and he immediately wrote in his own hand on a sheet of paper a prayer to the God of mercy in behalf of that poor repentant sinner, and at the same time supplicated the divine bounty to transfer to him all the merits which he himself might have acquired throughout the course of his life. He confessed the dying man, then placed in his hands the written document. The latter soon entered into a sweet agony, and peacefully expired. Scarcely had he drawn his last breath than the document disappeared. It followed the soul to the tribunal of the supreme judge. The divine majesty was pleased to give it a public and authentic testimony, in order that the fact coming to the knowledge of sinners might inspire them also with obedience to the words of his ambassador. While Vincent was preaching in a public square to more than 30,000 persons, they beheld the sheet of paper which he had given to the dying person descend from heaven, and it fell into his hands. This was an object of general astonishment, for no one was cognizant of this mystery. But their surprise knew no bounds when Vincent, having read the document, told the people that it was the petition written with his own hand, given to the sick man who had scandalized the city by his sinful conduct, and who had resolved to die impenitent. That man had heard him, that he himself had confessed him, that when dying he had taken the piece of paper and presented it at the tribunal of God, that the sovereign judge had accepted it, that he had signed its authenticity, and that, finally, he had a perfect certainty of that soul's salvation. We can easily judge of the impression which this surprising miracle would produce on the minds of the multitude. As for ourselves, what excites our admiration even more is the charity of the saint, who so completely forgot himself that he could only think of others, and who joyfully relinquished all the spiritual treasures of his life that he might ensure the eternal felicity of his neighbor. How could sinners after this resist such sincere proofs of love and devotion? We need not therefore be surprised at the extraordinary success of St. Vincent Ferrer. If faith removes mountains, we must not forget that love is strong as death, and that nothing can resist it. The saint, formed in the school of the blessed Dominic, possessed in the highest degree every moral virtue: justice, obedience, temperance, chastity, poverty, mortification, humility, sweetness, affability, generosity, magnanimity, courage, constancy. Many examples are to be found in the spiritual instruction, both for the Fridays before and after his feast, as well as in the novena. For the edification of the reader, we will give an outline of those virtues which are not to be met with in the pages referred to, since he would doubtless not be willing that we should omit them in this chapter. First of all, let us not pass over in silence the following example, which shows the perfection of his chastity. He was already a religious when certain envious persons, annoyed at the encomiums that were passed on his virtue, and urged by a diabolical inspiration, bribed with a large sum of money a profligate woman to secrete herself in the saint's cell. They helped her to accomplish her purpose one winter while he prolonged his prayer in the church. When Vincent opened the door and found the miserable creature seated at the foot of his bed, he thought at first it was an artifice of the devil, who wished to tempt him under that seducing form. He made the sign of the cross and exclaimed, "What doest thou here, Satan, enemy of God?" "I am not Satan," answered the profligate, "but a young woman who can no longer resist the love she bears towards you." She was about to continue, but the saint interrupted her in a brief and imperious tone. "Go hence, the wretch," cried he, "and be careful lest a sudden death overtake thee by reason of thy frightful iniquity. How darest thou attempt to sully my body and soul, which from my childhood I have consecrated to Jesus Christ?" Whether from fright or from excessive impudence, the unhappy woman remained immovable. When Vincent cast some burning cinders from a brazier on the floor, and kneeling upon them said, "Come, if thou darest, come and cast thyself on this fire. It is not so terrible as that of hell." At this spectacle the woman became half dead, weeping, sobbing, imploring pardon of the saint, and promising him that she would entirely change her life. She disclosed to him the names of those who had led her to this act. Vincent dismissed her, commanding her to conceal the names of her accomplices. But she did not promise silence. On the following morning she related all, and covered with shame those who sought to calumniate and dishonor the saint. The sinner became sincerely converted. Despite his gushing and ardent character, Vincent Ferrer exhibited a patience that was proof against every trial. From his childhood he strove to repress anger. One day a servant in his father's house blasphemed the name of our Lord. Vincent, following the first impulse of his indignation, severely reprimanded him. The latter did not profit by it. He replied with injurious epithets, and even struck the child. The young saint, instead of crying and complaining, changed his zeal to meekness, and said to the man, Dear brother, I owe you much. In chastening me, you have taught me the prudence which it is proper to observe in correcting persons older than oneself, and especially servants who are in anger. I shall know it another time. The man, whose name was Alexis Raffet, was so astonished at this patience, this heroic sweetness and humility, that he cast himself at the child's feet to ask his pardon, and implored him not to mention to his father or mother what had happened. Vincent threw himself into his arms, and with a radiant countenance said to him, "Do not fear. They shall know nothing of what is past. Only, my dear friend, do not blaspheme in the future." When afflicted with a great suffering towards the end of his life, he underwent a surgical operation without uttering the slightest groan. He only invoked tenderly the sweet names of Jesus, Mary, or some saint. He drank without dislike the bitter draughts which were administered to him. He was frequently during the course of his apostolate almost stifled by the people, and once remained as dead under the feet of the multitude. He made no complaint, and on rising exhibited a placid countenance, as though he had suffered nothing. When his infirmities obliged him to the use of an ass, he from time to time sustained severe falls. Yet on these occasions he never exhibited the least sign of impatience. But, as his disciples remarked with astonishment, in reward of this virtue, God never permitted him to suffer any inconvenience from these accidents. Not only did Vincent practice this virtue which renders man amiable to those who live with him, but he also inculcated it in others with great tact. One day a woman came to him, complaining bitterly of the bad treatment she had to endure on the part of her husband. "Teach me, my good father," she said, "an efficacious method of preserving peace at home, in order that my husband may cease to ill-use me both by word and deed." The saint allowed her uninterrupted speech, well knowing the cause of the evil for which she sought a remedy. It was only her loquacity and petulance. She irritated her husband by her chattering and provoking answers. Then the saint quietly said to her, "If you wish to put an end to these disagreeable scenes, go to the brother porter of our convent, and bid him give you a jug of water from the well in which is in the middle of the cloister. When your husband returns home, take at once a mouthful of this water without swallowing it, and retain it for a considerable time in your mouth. If you do this, I assure you that your husband will no more be angry with you, and will become meek as a lamb." The woman immediately hastened to execute the saint's advice, seeing that the remedy was by no means a difficult one. When the husband returned home and began to show symptoms of irritation, she ran to the jug and filled her mouth with water, which she retained as long as she was able, the result being that, meeting with no reply, the husband himself was silent. He wondered at this, but said nothing, and thanked God for having changed the heart and closed her mouth, whence proceeded all their disputes. Having put this advice in practice many times, and always with the same success, the woman returned to St. Vincent overflowing with thanks to him for having taught her so excellent a remedy. Then the saint, speaking to her with sweetness, plainly told her, "The remedy which I have taught you, my daughter, is not the water from the well, as you suppose, but silence. By holding your tongue, you have preserved peace between yourself and your husband. You had scarcely entered the house, when you irritated him by your troublesome questions. It was your own fault if this anger increased. Your provoking rejoinders were the cause of it. Be silent in the future, and you will always live in peace with your husband." Hence the common proverb in Valencia, When a woman complained of her husband, she answered, "Fill your mouth with water, and what St. Vincent said will come to pass."